There are a number of reasons I could give you why I've long preferred St. Luke among the Gospel writers, but not the least of them is the challenging portrait he provides us of Jesus in his post-resurrection appearances. This pair of vignettes brilliantly captures, I think, the mood of uncertainty and incomprehension among Jesus' followers. Their fear, their incredulity, and finally their wonder at what is in the process of happening to them. And so in the verses before today's Gospel, we've heard that the women who first discovered Jesus' empty tomb are assumed by the other disciples to be telling an idle tale. Only Simon Peter proves willing to take the chance of checking for himself that the tomb is in fact empty, as the women say. This is then followed by the account of the two travelers on the road to Emmaus, who are so caught up in the process of trying to understand what's going on that they fail to recognize it is Jesus himself who is their mysterious traveling companion. Only when Jesus breaks bread with them does his true self become intelligible to these unnamed followers. And now today in Luke we have the final account of Jesus appearing to his disciples as a whole group. Yet despite the testimonies they've already heard from other people and which they're busy mulling over for themselves, they are nonetheless, we are told, startled and terrified when Jesus actually appears in their presence. Why are you frightened, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? He asks them. This can be nothing if not a rhetorical question at this stage. Jesus knows his followers better than they know themselves, and he's plainly trying to coax them into some recognition of the way their own lives have been transformed by recent events. He even invites them then to poke and prod him like a specimen in a biology class, showing just how far he's willing to go to make the truth of his resurrection real and tangible. No recourse to ghost stories will be allowed as a means of dodging the flesh and blood reality of his presence. And there is perhaps something rather poignant in the detail of Jesus eating a piece of broiled fish, as if to say no human act, however quotidian or mundane, will be excluded from the comprehensive reality of his resurrected being. It was the American author John Updike who evoked this insistence, I think, so powerfully in his 1961 poem, 7 Stanzas of Easter, which I'd like to read to you now. Make no mistake. If he rose at all, it was his body. If the cell's dissolution did not reverse, the molecules reknit, the amino acids rekindle, the church will fall. It was not as the flowers, each soft spring recurrent. It was not as his spirit in the mouths and fuddled eyes of the 11 apostles. It was as his flesh, ours. The same hinged thumbs and toes, the same velvet heart that pierced, died, withered, paused, and then regathered out of enduring might new strength to enclose. Let us not mock God with metaphor, analogy, sidestepping transcendence, making of the event a parable, a sign painted in the faded credulity of earlier ages. Let us walk through the door. The stone is rolled back, not papier-mâché, not a stone in a story, but the vast rock of materiality that in the slow grinding of time will eclipse for each of us the wide light of day. And if we will have an angel at the tomb, make it a real angel, weighty with Max Planck's quanta, vivid with hair, opaque in the dawn light, robed in real linen, spun on a definite loom. Let us not seek to make it less monstrous for our own convenience, our own sense of beauty, lest, awakened in one unthinkable hour, we are embarrassed by the miracle and crushed by remonstrance. Don't know about you, but Updike's poem never fails to catch me out. I always feel a personal indictment in his evocation of all the ways we tend to rationalize away what he calls the monstrous truth of the physical resurrection. So many intelligent Christians have struggled to find ways not to take the resurrection literally, as if by doing so we necessarily forfeit a claim to being those sane, reasonable, and tasteful people we so fervently believe ourselves to be. Yet the disciples, whom we now celebrate as paragons of the faith, they were none of these things on that fateful day when Jesus appeared before them. Instead, they're presented here in Luke as a walking bundle of conflicting emotions, so full of disbelief, but also of wonder and joy, and all at the same time. So if Luke's portrait serves here to cut through the equivocations sometimes used to make Christian faith more palatable, it likewise undermines any urge we might have to mistake that faith for certainty, or to confuse belief for the mere accumulation of facts. What's so striking then, I think, about the disciples is that when they encounter the risen Jesus, they conform to neither of these tendencies. Indeed, what today's gospel and our reading from the book of Acts both highlight is just how different is Luke's conception of Christian witness from what we so often assume it to be. When Jesus says to the disciples, "You are witnesses to these things," he's clear their chief responsibility is to affirm that it is God who has kept his promise. It is God who has kept the promise he made of old to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, that his people will someday know his redemption. And so in Acts, Peter proclaims, "We are witnesses to the fulfillment of this promise through Christ's death and resurrection." And what is, of course, striking is that in empowering someone who cannot walk, Peter is emphatic that this miraculous intervention is purely a form of witness. In no way, he says, should it be taken as a product of our own piety and power. In both passages, then, there's an absence of self-expression in the act of witness. Jesus' witness to his own resurrection is anything but personally triumphant. We need only recall that rather earthy detail of his eating a piece of fish to recognize an essential humility in his approach. And when he tells the disciples that they are witnesses, he cannot fail to know he's conferring this massive responsibility upon people who remain more than a little vague about what it all means. But surely this is precisely the reason Jesus has chosen them, and the essential characteristics of their witness: the tentativeness, the openness, the selfless wonder at something barely comprehended but essential to live by and to share. All this, it seems to me, also lies at the heart of how we also are called to respond to the resurrection story in our own lives. For those who would instead try to make the case for Christian faith on the basis of carefully calibrated arguments, they usually only succeed in witnessing to the intellectual vanity in themselves. Equally, those who construe witness as a never-ending process of winning converts to Christ testify to another kind of vanity, that of spreading the good news not as testimony to God's mystery, but as a validation of their own fragile sense of self-worth. While many of us may not conform to either of these tendencies, none of us is exempt, I think, from the temptation to confuse our witness to Christ with a witness to our own wisdom or our own persuasiveness. Yet Jesus' physical resurrection makes a nonsense of all such efforts. And its best witnesses always end up seeming to be precisely those people who are most surprised by it, indeed most perplexed by the transformative impact the resurrection has had on their lives. This was what finally made the witness of the first disciples so powerful, and what has the potential to make our witness powerful still. That is, the simple and selfless act of telling a story whose meaning we can never fully hope to comprehend, to grasp, and yet whose faithful telling and retelling becomes our life and our wonder and our joy. Amen.